Hey guys, tonight we begin with ancient China, and its famously comprehensive system for making sure everyone knew exactly what would happen to them if they stepped out of line, which is a sentence that sounds reassuring until you find out what stepping out of line actually meant. We will also spend some time with Zetian, the only woman who ever ruled China as emperor in her own name, who got there by a path that makes every modern political career look quaint and pleasant. Then we are going to find out what it was actually like to be a jailer in an Imperial Chinese prison, which was a job that came with more responsibilities than you might expect, and considerably more danger than anyone advertised. And finally, we are going to look at how the Chinese legal system really worked behind its official image of precision and fairness, which involved a surprising amount of hitting people until they agreed with the official version of events. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you are tuning in from and what time it is. I always like seeing where in the world people are watching from. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let us ease into tonight's journey together. You did not plan for this. That is the first thing worth saying. Whatever brought you to this moment, whatever sequence of decisions or accidents or misunderstandings, or genuine grievances or simple bad luck led you here, you were not planning for this particular morning, in this particular courtyard, in this particular quality of grey light that sits over a Chinese city before the day has fully committed to beginning. And yet here you are. And the thing that matters now is that this world has been planning for people like you for a very long time, with considerably more care and detail than you have given it in return. Ancient China had laws, not vague suggestions about proper conduct, not local customs open to local interpretation, not the informal expectations of a community that adjusts itself based on whoever is in charge this season. Actual written laws, codified, organised, updated across centuries by some of the most methodical legal minds in human history. The Tang Code, which the dynasty that bears its name produced in the 7th century in its most developed form, ran to approximately 500 articles covering everything from treason and rebellion, down through property disputes, family conflicts, and the precise administrative infractions that officials committed when they failed to process their paperwork on the correct timeline. It specified punishments with a granularity that would impress a modern legislature. It was not a rough guide. It was not a starting point for negotiation. It was a machine, carefully engineered, operating according to internal logic that had been tested and refined through generations, and you have just been fed into it. You become aware of your situation in the early morning, which is already a bad sign, because nothing good in ancient China begins in the early morning with a knock at your door from officials who are not smiling. They come in a small group, 2 men in front and 1 behind, their robes marking them as belonging to the magistrate's office. Their expressions are not hostile exactly. They are professional. There is no particular cruelty in the way they look at you, and no particular sympathy either. They are performing a function, which is in some ways considerably worse than hostility. Hostility can be argued with. Professionalism is simply a system doing what systems do, and systems do not argue back. You are told to come with them. This is not technically a request, in the sense that requests carry with them the genuine possibility of refusal. Language is being used, and language implies the structure of communication, and communication implies the theoretical existence of a response. But the 3 officials standing in your doorway in the grey early morning light, along with the general weight of everything you understand about how this works and what it means when it works, makes the theoretical nature of that option feel extremely thin, like paper held up against fire. You go with them. The walk through the streets to the magistrate's yamen is not long in physical terms, but it manages to feel long in the way that significant walks always do, the way that distance expands when what lies at the end of it is uncertain, and the world you're moving through is suddenly composed of details you would not normally notice. You pass through familiar spaces that now look slightly different, as if the angle of your relationship to them has shifted just enough to make everything look like a version of itself rather than the actual thing. The market stall where you buy rice in the mornings is there, its owner already arranging his goods for the day ahead, with the same efficient motions he uses every morning. He sees you walking with the officials. He does not look away quickly enough to hide the fact that he is seen. That is the first small weight you begin to carry. People in ancient China were embedded in social networks in ways that made individual privacy essentially theoretical. a pleasant idea that did not map cleanly onto the actual texture of daily life. Your neighbours knew your business in the detailed way that neighbours know things when walls are not thick and windows are open, and community life takes place largely in shared spaces. Your family's reputation was inseparable from your own, in ways that ran backward into the past and forward into the future simultaneously. The ward or village you lived in had collective responsibilities that bound it together, a system of mutual surveillance and accountability that had been formalised under various dynasties into explicit institutional arrangements, where households were grouped together and held jointly responsible for reporting offences among their members. This was not always oppressive in practice. It often simply meant that everyone paid attention, and that paying attention was normalised, and that what was normalised produced over time a social environment in which the magistrate's network of community informants was less a separate intelligence apparatus and more a formalisation of what was already happening naturally. Someone almost always knew something. That information had a way of arriving at official desks with a reliability that would impress a modern bureaucracy. The Amiens is a place with a particular kind of gravity, the kind you feel before you are fully inside it. The main gate is flanked by painted images of door gods, fierce protective figures whose expressions are not welcoming, and whose entire visual presence communicates that what happens inside this space is serious and should be approached with the understanding that seriousness will be returned. The courtyard beyond the gate is wide and carefully maintained. Its cleanliness is itself a form of statement, an assertion that things are kept in proper order here, that disorder is brought inside and processed rather than allowed to persist. You cross the courtyard with the officials and feel the space doing what spaces designed to communicate authority do, making you smaller without anyone having to say anything. You're taken to wait in a side room. Waiting in a magistrate's yamen is not like waiting anywhere else you have ever waited. There is no seat that permits comfort. There is no ambient noise that allows distraction. There is only a room with walls and the slowly building awareness that what comes next is already determined in its structure, even if the specific content of your situation is still technically open to the examination that will shortly begin. The structure is not the content. The structure was built long before you arrived. The content is what you are here to provide. The room has a small window that faces an interior wall. The light it admits is diffused and directionless, which means you cannot tell much about the time from it, only that it is morning and that morning is continuing. You sit on a low bench that is made of good wood and designed to serve its purpose without communicating anything warm about the experience of sitting on it. You think about the market stall owner and whether he has told anyone yet. You think about your family, wherever they are in this morning, what they know and do not know, what they're doing with the absence that your early departure has created. You try not to think about those things and succeed approximately the way people always succeed at trying not to think about things, which is to say, not at all. The magistrate arrives in a way that is clearly designed to communicate the weight of what he represents. This is not arrogance, or not only arrogance, it is the ritual expression of an institutional reality. The robe he wears, its colour and pattern marking his official rank, the hat that is specific to his position, the table arranged in front of him with the appropriate objects in the appropriate places, the clerks seated to either side with their brushes already prepared and their ink already ground, all of it constructs an authority that does not belong to this particular man as an individual, but to the entire imperial apparatus that he embodies in this specific moment. He is the emperor's representative in this proceeding. The emperor is the son of heaven. Heaven is the ultimate source of the order that your presence here is alleged to have disrupted. When the magistrate asks you a question, it is therefore, in some technical but genuinely meaningful sense, the emperor asking. And the emperor, through the chain of cosmic and administrative hierarchy that connects this small room to the throne in the capital, is asking on behalf of the proper arrangement of all things. He asks you a question. It is a carefully framed question, which means it has been prepared, which means your case has been under consideration for longer than this morning, which is itself information, and not entirely comforting information. You answer carefully. This means that your answer is also a performance of carefulness, which the magistrate notices, because he has done this many times before, and the performance of carefulness is one of the things he has developed considerable expertise in reading. Not just the words, the posture, the specific way you chose which details to include and which to arrange first, the pace of your speech, where it slows and where it does not. He is listening to all of it at once, the way a physician listens to a patient, attending to the information that the body communicates alongside and sometimes despite what the mouth is saying. A clerk records what you say in the precise, compressed vocabulary of official documentation. This vocabulary is not your vocabulary. It is the language into which your words are translated as they move from the air of this room into the permanence of the official record, and that translation, like all translations, involves choices. The gap between what you actually said and what appears in that record is not necessarily dishonest in the ordinary sense. It is simply the conversion of lived experience into the specialized vocabulary of a legal system, and that vocabulary does not have words for everything you would like to say. It does have very precise words for the things it is designed to capture, and it captures those things with a thoroughness that makes the record something genuinely different from a simple transcript of the conversation. The charges against you are read. This is the moment when the system reveals itself most clearly, because the charges are specific. They belong to a category. This is not incidental. In ancient Chinese law, offences were organised into a hierarchy that legal scholars across multiple dynasties had worked out with enormous care, driven partly by the Confucian conviction that proper categorization was itself a moral act, and partly by the practical administrative understanding that a system which could not categorize consistently could not function. At the very top of the hierarchy sat the 10 abominations, the gravest offences against the cosmic and social order: plotting rebellion against the state, plotting great sedition, plotting treason, contumacy, depravity, great irreverence, lack of filial piety, discord, unrighteousness, and incest. These were not merely serious crimes. They were understood to be disruptions of fundamental relationships, violations that the cosmos itself registered as wrongs requiring cosmic repair. Below the 10 abominations came offences organised by the nature and severity of their prescribed punishments, working down through the 5 categories of penalty that the code recognised: death in its 2 forms of strangulation and decapitation, exile in 3 degrees of distance, each greater distance representing a greater degree of removal from the community and the social networks that sustained a person's life, penal servitude, in which the convicted person was required to perform hard labour for a specified period, heavy beating with a thick bamboo rod, and finally light beating with a thin bamboo rod, the lowest category, applicable to the largest range of relatively minor offences. Where your alleged offence sits in this hierarchy matters more than almost anything else about your situation. It determines the path of the proceeding, the level of review required, the options available to you and to the magistrate, the degree of discretion that exists at different stages, and the nature of what is about to happen to your life over the coming days and months and possibly years. You listen to the charges being read and feel the weight of the category settling around you, not like a verdict, not yet, but like the shape of the container you're now inside. The magistrate's expression has not changed. He looks at you with the focused attention of someone who is tracking several things at once: your words, the evidence that has been assembled, the category, the documentation requirements, the weight of precedent that governs what he can and cannot do, and the level of the offence relative to the review requirements that will determine how much of this stays within his authority and how much moves upward. This is not arbitrary. That is one of the things you keep coming back to as the proceeding continues. Whatever else it is not arbitrary. The system has rules for why it does everything it does, and those rules connect to each other in a logic that is internally consistent even when its external consequences feel very different from consistent. You are asked to explain yourself more fully. This is your moment, and you feel the weight of it in a specific way. The awareness that what you say here, how you frame the situation, whether you demonstrate the appropriate understanding of what you're accused of and the appropriate deference to the process itself, and the appropriate understanding of your own position in the hierarchy of relationships that the charge implicates, will matter. This is not a moment for argument in the adversarial sense that a later or different legal tradition might have created space for. The system was not designed to accommodate a defendant who contests the fundamental validity of the process, or who challenges the magistrate's authority, or who introduces arguments designed to reframe the proceeding itself. It was designed for defendants to provide accurate information, to acknowledge what they had done, to demonstrate that they understood the nature of the disruption their actions had caused, and to allow the system to repair that disruption in the prescribed way. There were exceptions. There were formal mechanisms for appeal. There were review processes for serious cases that allowed incorrect lower-level decisions to be caught and corrected at higher levels. But those mechanisms operated within the system's own logic, not against it, and accessing them required a precise understanding of how and when to use them that not everyone possessed. You explain yourself as carefully as you can. You choose your words with the awareness that they are being converted into a different language even as you speak them, a language that will travel without you to places you cannot follow, the clock writes. The magistrate listens. The room is warm and very still. A follow-up question arrives before you have fully settled into the idea that your explanation was complete. The magistrate asks it in a tone that does not suggest aggression, but that does suggest that your explanation raised something requiring further attention. You answer the follow-up. Another question follows the follow-up. This is how the examination proceeds, not as a direct confrontation, but as a series of small incremental probes that map the territory of your account and identify the places where the map and the official understanding of events do not align, or do not align perfectly, or align in ways that require additional explanation. By the time the initial examination ends, the morning has advanced significantly. The quality of the light coming through the small window has changed, warmer and more direct, which means the sun has risen fully and the day has committed to being the day it was going to be. You have been sitting in this room for hours without entirely registering that hours have passed, because time in official proceedings has a way of losing its ordinary texture and becoming something flatter and harder to read. There is a recess. Someone brings you water, not as a kindness exactly, though it is not unkind, but as a practical necessity of a long proceeding. You drink it and sit with the specific silence of the empty room, which is a different silence from the silence of the room when people were in it. That silence was full of the proceeding's own weight. This silence is the silence of the proceeding suspended, still present but temporarily held in abeyance, and it has its own texture, the texture of something that has been paused rather than finished, which means it will resume. The social infrastructure of your situation exists at multiple levels that you find yourself thinking about during the recess. There is the formal level, the charges, the category, the prescribed process, the documentation. There is the level of your personal history and your relationships, who you know and how those relationships interact with the official process. And there is the level of collective responsibility, the way that certain categories of offence carried implications not just for the person charged, but for the household and the family network around them. This was not an incidental feature of the legal system. It was a philosophical position, an expression of the Confucian understanding that individuals were not autonomous units making individual choices in isolation, but nodes in webs of relationship and obligation that ran in every direction, and that those webs were real social structures with real social responsibilities, and that the violation of proper conduct was never entirely an individual act, because there was no such thing as an entirely individual act. This meant that your situation was not entirely your situation. It belonged also to everyone whose life was connected to yours in the ways that the system recognized, and they were living it alongside you right now, in their own rooms with their own quality of silence, thinking about versions of the same thing from different angles. That knowledge sits with you during the recess and does not make the recess easier. The magistrate returns and the proceeding resumes. More questions, more careful answers, more conversion of experience into documentation. The afternoon arrives without fanfare, and then begins to move toward evening in the same gradual way that afternoons in significant proceedings always do, more slowly than other afternoons, more weighted, each quarter hour carrying more than a quarter hour's worth of accumulation. You understand, by now, that this will not be resolved today. The system was built to be thorough, and thoroughness requires time, and the time this requires is not a sign that something is going wrong. It is a sign that something is going exactly as designed. Evidence is being gathered, witnesses may be called, documentary records that bear on the case will be examined, the level of review appropriate to the category of your offence will be determined, and that level of review will shape the timeline going forward in ways that you can begin to predict in outline, even if you cannot see the specific shape the outcome will take. You are eventually taken from the examining room to a different space, a waiting space that has the particular quality of places designed for holding rather than for resolving. The walls are the same kind of wall as everywhere else, solid and not interested in your feelings. The floor is swept. The light is fading. Somewhere outside, through the thickness of the walls that separate this space from the street, the city is conducting its evening in the way that cities do, with the mixture of activity and settling that marks the end of the working day, in any place where people live together, and you are not part of that evening except as an absence, a slot in the normal texture of the day that is no longer filled in the usual way. You think about the charges again, you think about the category, you think about the specific words the clerk wrote down, and the gap between those words and the words you said and what that gap might mean as the documentation moves through the levels of review it is going to move through. You think about your family and what they are having for the evening meal and whether anyone has told them what you know. You think about the market stall owner and how quickly the news of what he saw this morning has travelled, and how far it has travelled by now and in what form it is travelling. You think about the system itself, this enormous patient machine that has been running for centuries, that has processed people in situations like yours across all those centuries with a consistency and a thoroughness that individual magistrates come and go without disrupting. The magistrate who examined you today will retire or die or be reassigned, and another will sit behind the same table and ask questions with the same brushes in the same ink, and produce documents in the same vocabulary that will move through the same channels. You're inside something that was here before you, and will be here after you, and is completely indifferent to that fact about itself. The way that all genuine systems are indifferent to their own continuity, because continuity does not require awareness of itself. The light in the room has nearly gone. Someone comes and hangs a small lamp in a bracket on the wall. The flame is steady and orange and produces just enough light to see by, without producing enough warmth to make the space comfortable, which is the right amount for a space that was not designed to be comfortable, only functional. You settle into the waiting, not because you have accepted anything, and not because the weight has lifted, but because waiting is what the moment requires, and the moment is not offering alternatives. The proceeding will continue in the morning. The documentation will continue accumulating. The machine will continue processing what it has been given. And you will be here, inside it, which is precisely where the machine expected you to be. The question of what you actually did, and whether what you actually did maps onto the category you've been assigned, is one you've been turning over since the proceeding began, because the mapping is not always obvious, and the category is not always forgiving about ambiguity. Ancient Chinese law was attentive to intent. The code made distinctions between accidental harm and deliberate harm, between offences committed in ignorance of the rule and offences committed in full knowledge of it, between actions taken under coercion and actions taken freely, and those distinctions mattered for the prescribed punishment in ways that were specific and documented. But establishing intent required the magistrate to make a determination about what was in your mind at the time of the action, which is the kind of determination that no documentary procedure can make with perfect certainty, and that therefore rested on the quality of the examination, the plausibility of the various accounts of what happened, and the judgment of the official conducting the proceeding. That judgment was not unconstrained. The magistrate operated within a framework of precedent, of earlier decisions on similar cases, of official commentaries on the code that had accumulated across generations, and that formed a layer of interpretive authority between the formal text of the law and its application in specific circumstances. When scholars and officials across centuries added their interpretations to the original code provisions, they were doing something that legal traditions everywhere do, working out the implications of general rules in the face of specific situations that the original drafters could not have anticipated. These commentaries were treated as authoritative. They had the force of the code's own provisions in practice, and they had been shaped by real cases, by the accumulated experience of many magistrates confronting the same kinds of ambiguities that you are facing now, working out what the rule was supposed to say by working through what happened when they applied it. You know some of this, not in the detail of a scholar, but in the way that people who live inside a system know it, through exposure, through stories, through the accumulated folk wisdom about how the official machinery tends to work in practice. That knowledge is one of the things you're drawing on as you answer the magistrate's questions, calibrating your answers to the shape of the framework you know you are inside, trying to present your situation in the categories that the framework handles best. This is not dishonesty, necessarily. It is the ordinary translation of lived experience into institutional language that anyone who has ever dealt with a formal system has had to do. the reduction of everything complicated and particular about a situation to the vocabulary that the system has available for processing it. The difficulty is that the vocabulary does not have words for everything. The specific texture of what led you here, the particular combination of circumstances and relationships and pressures and decisions that produced the action you're now being examined for cannot be fully conveyed in the compressed official language of a legal record. What the record will contain is a legible account of what happened, organised according to the categories the system provides, with the ambiguities resolved in the direction that the examination pushed them. That account will be true in the sense that it does not contain outright fabrications that you introduced. It will not be complete in the sense of containing everything that is true about the situation. If you like the video so far, please leave us a like and a sub. A sub to the channel helps us make more videos for you to watch and keep the channel alive. And it is the incomplete official language version that will travel upward through the review process and ultimately determine what happens to you. This is not unique to ancient China. It is not even unique to legal systems. It is what happens every time human experience passes through an institutional process, which is to say, it is one of the fundamental transactions of organised social life, and it has been happening in some form everywhere that human beings have organised themselves into communities with rules. The specific institution changes, the categories change, the vocabulary changes. The fundamental gap between the texture of experience and the official record of it does not. What you can do, what you are doing, is attend to the process with as much care and clarity as the situation allows. You answer the questions as accurately as you can. You frame your account with the awareness of how the framing affects the categorization. You remain present in the examination in a way that communicates respect for the procedure, because disrespect for the procedure is itself a kind of data that the magistrate is collecting, and that data can affect outcomes in ways that have nothing to do with the underlying facts. You do not argue, you explain. The distinction between arguing and explaining is one of the more practically important distinctions available to someone in your position, and you're holding it carefully. The afternoon examination session ends. There is food, simple and adequate in the way that everything in this situation is simple and adequate, sufficient to the function without any claim to comfort. You eat it with the mechanical attentiveness of someone whose hunger has been present for hours, but whose awareness of hunger has been overridden by larger concerns. And now that the larger concerns have paused, the hunger has reasserted itself with the matter-of-fact persistence of physical reality refusing to be managed. You eat. It helps in the specific ways that eating always helps, which do not include any of the larger ways that would also be helpful. The evening settles around the facility. Through the walls you cannot see the sunset, but you can feel the quality of the light changing in the small openings that admit air to the space, the diffuse glow becoming warmer and then fading toward grey. Somewhere in the administrative sections of the Yamen, the clerks are finishing their day's work, organising the records of today's proceedings, adding them to the accumulating documentation of your case, preparing the materials that will be needed for tomorrow's session. The machine does not pause, it only changes shift. You think about your family again, more specifically this time, the particular faces and the particular voices and the particular shape of the household that was the ordinary texture of your life before this morning introduced a before and after into it. You think about the obligations that run in both directions, the ones you owe and the ones you are owed, the web of reciprocal relationship that the Confucian framework names as the foundation of social existence, and that the legal system treats as the context within which your actions must be understood. You are not an individual who acted in isolation. You are a person embedded in a network of relationships, and what you did, whatever it was, happened inside that network, and has consequences that move through it in ways that the official proceeding will attempt to map, and that the official proceeding will inevitably only partially capture. This is one of the things that makes the situation heavy in a way that goes beyond the personal consequences you face. You are inside a system that takes the social network seriously, that sees individual actions as events in a relational web, and that distributes the consequences of those actions accordingly. The weight is not only yours. Others are carrying some portion of it right now, and they did not necessarily choose to, and the degree to which the system attends to that fact, the degree to which it is moved by considerations of fairness in the distribution of consequences across people who had different degrees of agency in the events being examined, varies in ways that are not always predictable. You cannot control most of this. You can control the quality of your attention, the care of your answers, the respect you show for the process. You can do the work of being a person clearly present in your own situation, rather than absent from it, through fear or confusion or the temptation to treat the proceeding as something happening to you rather than something you are participating in. Those are small controls in the face of a large machine, but they are the ones available to you, and you exercise them with the deliberateness that the situation deserves. Night arrives. The lamp in your room continues its steady orange burning. The sounds of the facility settle into their nighttime version, quieter than the day but not silent. The presence of people in enclosed spaces always generating its own ambient noise, the movements and the breathing and the occasional voices that drift through walls that are substantial but not perfectly soundproof. You lie on the surface provided and do not sleep immediately, which is not surprising, and wait for sleep in the way that people wait for sleep when too much has happened for the mind to simply set it down, which is to say you wait with patience and without expectation, and eventually, in the ordinary way of things, the waiting resolves itself. The specific mechanics of the proceeding, the physical arrangement of the space, the sequence in which things happened, communicated meanings that you were absorbing gradually, the way that any sufficiently expressive environment communicates things through its structure rather than through explicit statement. The magistrate's elevated position was not just practical, it was the physical expression of a hierarchy of authority that the room was designed to make legible without requiring anyone to say it aloud. The clerks on either side were not decorative. Their presence and their activity, the ongoing process of converting the spoken into the written, was a continuous reminder that this was a proceeding that produced permanent record, that what was said here did not disappear when the session ended, but was translated into a form that would persist and travel. The formal language of the proceeding had its own register, distinct from ordinary conversational speech, and that register did several things simultaneously. It marked the conversation as official, as different from informal exchange, as happening in a context where words had specific weight and where the relationship between what was said and what was meant was managed more carefully than it would be in ordinary social interaction. It constrained what could be said, not through explicit prohibition of topics, but through the implicit pressure of a vocabulary and a format that organized the conversation in specific directions and made other directions less available, and it created a kind of temporal structure, a rhythm of question and answer that paced the examination in ways that the magistrate controlled and that you could not easily disrupt. The specific questions you were asked, their sequence and their particular framings, also told you things. Some of them were establishing facts that the magistrate clearly already had from other sources, which meant he was testing the consistency of your account against what he knew or suspected. The ones where he paused after your answer, where the pause was slightly longer than the pace of the examination required, were the ones where your answer had introduced something requiring consideration, where the information you provided did not immediately slot into the framework he was building, or did so in a way that created a connection he had not already made. You learned to notice those pauses and to think carefully about what they might mean. The afternoon of the second day brought a change in the character of the examination. The first day had been primarily establishing, mapping the basic facts of the situation, the when and where and what of the events under examination. The second day moved into the territory of motivation and context, the questions about why, about the relationships between the various actors in the events, about the state of things before the events that were at issue. This is where the examination became more genuinely difficult, because motivation and context are exactly the places where the gap between lived experience and official vocabulary is widest, where the complexity of actual human life is most resistant to the kind of clean categorization the record requires. You were describing a situation that had developed over time, through a sequence of smaller events and decisions and pressures, in the way that most situations that become significant develop, not through a single clear choice, but through an accumulation of circumstances that arrive at a point where a specific action becomes, if not inevitable, then at least comprehensible in ways that a simple account of the action itself does not convey. The magistrate needed a categorizable account. You needed to provide one. The translation between what you knew about what had happened and what the proceeding needed to hear about what had happened was the work of those afternoon sessions, and it was harder than the first day's factual mapping had been. One of the witnesses who appeared was someone you knew. The social awkwardness of this encounter conducted within the formal structure of the official proceeding, was a specific kind of discomfort that the format did not have mechanisms to acknowledge. You listened to this person's account of events and understood, from small discrepancies and the particular framing of certain details, that they were giving the version of events that they believed served their own interests most effectively rather than the version that corresponded to what you understood to have happened. This was not unusual. Witnesses in official proceedings were people with interests, and their accounts reflected those interests in ways that they may not have been fully conscious of. The formal process treated their testimony as information to be weighed. You experienced it as something rather more immediate. The magistrate weighed it with the same measured attention he gave everything else. He asked clarifying questions. He compared it against what you had said. He examined the places where the accounts diverged and pressed into those places with the particular focus of someone who understood that divergence was data rather than simply noise. By the end of that session, the shape of the case had become clearer, both to him and to you, though not necessarily the same clarity, and not necessarily a clarity that pointed in the same direction. The days had a particular quality of sameness that was distinct from the sameness of ordinary routine. Ordinary routine is sameness within a life, within the context of daily existence, where the repetition of familiar things is background to the foreground of everything that makes life what it is. This sameness was sameness instead of life, the proceeding replacing the texture of daily existence rather than being part of it, filling the time with its own quality of suspended animation that had nothing to do with ordinary time except that it occupied the same physical hours. You thought about the people whose daily existence had not been suspended by all of this, the ordinary world continuing at its ordinary pace outside the walls that currently defined your experience. You thought about it not with resentment exactly, but with the particular awareness of absence that people feel when they are removed from the context that normally structure their sense of who they are and where they stand. Those contexts were continuing without you, adapting to your absence, filling the gap you had left in ways you could not observe and would have to rediscover when you returned to them, in whatever form and whatever condition the proceeding ultimately produced. The specific physical experience of the space you were held in during the proceeding had its own contribution to the education you were receiving about how the system worked. Spaces are not neutral. They are designed, even when the design is not conscious, to communicate things about the relationship between the people inside them, and the design of judicial and holding spaces in ancient China was rarely unintentional. The elevated position of the magistrate in the examining room was a physical encoding of the hierarchical relationship between the official and the examined, one that the body registered before the mind had processed it, so that the sense of the hierarchy was in some ways prior to its intellectual acknowledgement. The restricted access to natural light in holding spaces had its own effect, not simply as deprivation but as disorientation. Human beings track time through light, through the quality and angle of sunlight, through the darkening and the brightening that mark the day's passage. Spaces that reduced access to that tracking created a specific kind of temporal confusion that was not accidental in design, even if it was not always consciously intended. Time inside moved differently from time outside, and that difference was itself a form of pressure, a subtle but persistent reminder that you were inside a system that operated on its own schedule rather than on the schedule that the ordinary world used. The particular silence of official proceedings, the formal constraint on speech to the specific exchanges the proceeding permitted, had a related effect on the experience of self, to be unable to speak freely, to be constrained to the specific vocabularies and specific moments that the format allowed, was to experience a reduction of the ordinary modes of social presence, the constant small verbal exchanges through which people continuously establish and re-establish their positions in the social world around them. The formality of the proceeding stripped those small exchanges out, leaving you with only the formal exchanges permitted by the proceeding, and in doing so altered the quality of your experience of yourself in ways that were difficult to separate from the simple anxiety of the situation. This was, in some sense, the point. The proceeding was not designed to make you comfortable with your ordinary social self. It was designed to place you in a specific relationship to authority and to the formal determination of your status, and that relationship required a reduction of the ordinary modes of social presence to the specific modes that the proceeding recognized. Whether this reduction was experienced as deeply unsettling or as merely awkward depended on the individual and the specifics of their situation, but it was rarely experienced as neutral because it was not neutral. It was the deliberate structuring of an encounter between an individual and an institution in ways that communicated from the first moment where the power in that encounter resided. Understanding this from inside it was its own form of preparation for whatever came next. You were learning the system, as everyone who passes through any significant institutional encounter learns it, from the inside, in the way that is most instructive and most costly, through the experience of being processed by it, and paying attention to how the processing worked. That understanding would not undo what had happened or change the formal outcome of the proceeding. But it was real, and it was yours, and the system, for all its careful documentation of everything else, could not take it from you when you left. There is a certain kind of woman who is dangerous not because she breaks the rules, but because she understands them completely and uses them with a precision that makes everyone around her deeply uncomfortable. Zetian was that kind of woman, and she was also, by the time the very long story of her life reaches its extraordinary conclusion, the only person in the entire recorded history of China to have ruled the empire as emperor in her own right, not regent, not empress consort behind a male ruler, not the power behind a throne that technically belonged to someone else. Emperor, with the full title, with the full authority, with the full weight of the mandate of heaven, and the apparatus of imperial governance focused in her single person. This is either the most improbable achievement in Chinese political history, or the most logical conclusion of a particular kind of intelligence applied to a particular kind of system over a very long period of time. The answer, in all likelihood, is that it was both, and that the difference between improbable and logical depends entirely on where you're standing when you look at it. She was born in the year 624 into a family that occupied a comfortable and reasonably well-positioned place in the social landscape of early Tang China, without being at the apex of the old aristocratic hierarchy that dominated the court. Her father, Wu Shiyue, had been an early supporter of Li Yuan, the man who founded the Tang Dynasty by defeating the Sui, and that early loyalty had been rewarded with rank and access, the currency of a court where proximity to power was itself a form of power. These were the conditions of her early childhood: material comfort, education more extensive than most girls of her era received, and the particular kind of formation that comes from growing up in a household that knows how the game is played and has been playing it at a reasonable level for long enough to understand its rules. She entered the Imperial Palace at the age of 13 or 14 as a Chiron, a concubine of the 5th and lowest imperial rank, in the court of Emperor Taizong. The selection of imperial concubines was a formalized process. Families competed for the opportunity. Girls of appropriate background and appearance were evaluated. Those who passed were brought into the complex world of the imperial harem, which was not simply a household, but an institution, a deeply stratified social world with its own hierarchies, its own political dynamics, its own rewards and punishments and opportunities and dangers. The women inside it were real people, living real lives in a space that was simultaneously prestigious, restrictive, competitive, and extraordinarily consequential if a woman managed to navigate it successfully. Taizong noticed her, or so the accounts say, though the accounts of Wu Zetian's early life were shaped significantly by the retrospective attention of sources writing after she'd already become the most powerful person in China, which means they carry all the distortions that retrospection always introduces, the selection of details that seem significant in light of the outcome, the smoothing away of complications that do not serve the narrative clarity that later writers preferred. What can be said with reasonable confidence is that she was given a position in his household, that she was given a name by the emperor himself, Meiniang, and that she spent approximately a decade in the Tang court during Taizong's reign without attaining the kind of prominence that the position of favourite concubine might have brought. What she was doing during that decade, what she was learning, who she was watching and listening to and understanding, is harder to reconstruct, because the documentation from those years is thin and partial and heavily filtered. But it is not nothing to observe that someone who emerged from that decade with the political skills she subsequently demonstrated had spent those years in close proximity to the machinery of imperial governance, watching how decisions were made, how alliances formed and collapsed, how the official rhetoric of the court related to the actual movements of power within it, and how the men who held formal authority related to the women who occupied the informal spaces where so much of what actually mattered was decided. When Taizong died in the year 649, Wu faced the fate that awaited all imperial concubines who had not given birth to heirs: the shaved head and the Buddhist convent. This was not cruelty, it was institutional practice, a way of managing the population of women who had been part of the imperial household and who were now, with the emperor's death, no longer part of it in any active sense. The Ganyi temple received her. She was 25 years old. The story appeared to have reached its conclusion, or at least its principal climax, and that climax was a quiet room and a religious routine and the gradual fading from whatever small prominence she had occupied in the court of a man who was now gone. It was not the conclusion. The precise mechanics of what happened next are disputed in ways that are probably not resolvable with the evidence available, but the broad outline is clear. During Taizong's reign, his son and crown prince, the future Emperor Gaozong, had encountered Wu, and that encounter had been significant enough that when Gaozong became emperor, he found a way to retrieve her from the convent. She returned to court, still with the shaved head that marked her as technically a Buddhist nun, which must have made her entrance into the imperial household a visually striking event that would have communicated clearly to everyone present that something unusual was happening. She entered Gaozong's household, her rank and status rose in stages, and within a few years she had been elevated to the position of empress, displacing the previous empress, Wang, in a process that was neither simple nor bloodless, and that demonstrated, with considerable clarity, that Wu Zetian had arrived at the conclusion that the official version of imperial court politics was a framework to be operated rather than a set of constraints to be accepted. The opposition to her elevation was immediate, sustained, and articulate. The aristocratic families who formed the backbone of the Tang bureaucracy objected on multiple grounds, some of which were formally principled, and some of which were more naked in their concern about what her presence at the top of the imperial hierarchy meant for their own position. She was not from the highest aristocratic tier. She had been a concubine of the previous emperor, which created a specific kind of ritual irregularity that people with long institutional memories found persistently uncomfortable. She was a woman with opinions and the willingness to express them in contexts where women were not supposed to have opinions. All of these were real objections in the framework of Tang court culture, and they were pressed with the energy that institutional opposition tends to deploy when it senses that what is happening represents a genuine threat. Her response to this opposition was a masterclass in the use of a system's own mechanisms against the people who believed they were the system's natural operators. She cultivated alliances systematically among officials who were not from the old aristocratic families, men whose advancement depended on imperial favour rather than on inherited status and family networks, men who therefore had structural reasons to support the throne against the established clans, regardless of who sat closest to the throne. She engaged with the examination system actively, understanding that a meritocratic pathway to official rank that could theoretically elevate anyone who mastered the curriculum was also a pathway that produced men whose loyalty ran to the institution, rather than to the families that traditionally controlled it. She positioned herself as a patron of talent and ability in ways that created genuine gratitude and practical alliance. And she eliminated specific opponents when the opportunity presented itself, using the mechanisms of the legal system, which was itself supposed to be an impartial apparatus, in ways that demonstrated her understanding that impartial apparatuses are operated by people with interests, and that those interests can be engaged. Her relationship with Gaozong was genuinely complex in ways that resist the simplest versions of its characterization. He was not simply a weak man manipulated by an ambitious woman. He was a man with genuine political instincts who trusted her judgment because he had evidence that her judgment was good, and who gave her increasing formal authority over governmental matters as his health, which was genuinely poor for significant portions of his reign, limited his ability to manage those matters himself. They held joint court sessions. She was granted the authority to approve memorials and make decisions in his name in ways that were documented and formalized rather than merely informal. The court gave her the title of Empress, and she exercised the substance of that title in ways that went considerably beyond its ceremonial dimensions. When Gaozong died in the year 683, Wu was 58 years old. Two of her sons held the throne in succession over the following years, the first for only a few months before she had him removed, the second in a more complex arrangement in which her authority and practice exceeded his authority and title. In the year 690, she declared the end of the Tang Dynasty and the beginning of her own, the Zhou. She took the title of emperor. She was 65 years old. The declaration was not simply an act of personal ambition, though it was that. It was also a demonstration of how completely she understood the symbolic vocabulary of Chinese imperial legitimacy. She had spent decades cultivating the Buddhist establishment as a source of support and justification, commissioning texts that argued for the compatibility of female rulership with Buddhist cosmology and the precedents in Buddhist canonical literature for powerful women in positions of authority. She had managed the official historical record, the way that all emperors managed it, to shape the account of recent events in ways that supported her position. She had built the administrative apparatus, the personnel networks, the alliance structures that made the formal declaration a recognition of something that had been substantively true for years. If you like the video so far, please leave us a like and a sub. A sub to the channel helps us make more videos for you to watch and keep the channel alive. The 15 years she ruled as emperor were not universally praised by the sources that have come down to us, because the sources that have come down to us were largely written by men in a tradition that had strong and explicit views about women in imperial authority, and the record they produced reflects those views in ways that make the actual history of her governance harder to read cleanly. What careful examination of the evidence suggests is that the empire was administered with considerable competence during her reign, that the examination system expanded in ways that broadened access to official rank, that the Buddhist establishment flourished, and that the military campaigns of her period had outcomes that were a mixed record of success and failure in the way that most military campaigns of any emperor's reign tend to be. The opposition that eventually succeeded in removing her came not from outside but from within the official apparatus she had built. In the year 705, a group of senior officials, acting during a period when she was seriously ill and elderly, moved to restore the Tang Dynasty and place her son on the throne. She died later that year. She was 80 years old, and she was gone, but she had been there, and the empire had been governed, and the Tang Dynasty that restored itself in her wake had been shaped in ways that it carried forward without always acknowledging the source of the shaping. The questions her life raises are genuinely interesting, and genuinely uncomfortable in ways that do not simplify. She did things that the sources condemn in specific detail, and that modern readers, even those sympathetic to the extraordinary nature of what she accomplished, find difficult to excuse. She operated in a system that gave certain tools to powerful people, and she used those tools, and some of those tools were instruments of punishment and removal and death. That is true. It is also true that the men who opposed her and the men who came after her used the same tools with the same willingness, and that the historical record evaluated those uses very differently, because the evaluations were produced by people inside the same system of assumptions that she had challenged by existing. The history of Zetian is ultimately a history of what happens when someone who was not supposed to be able to learn the system learns it, and then uses it. The system survived her. She's a footnote, in some sense, a remarkable footnote, a footnote that produced a 15-year dynasty and left the Tang permanently altered, but a footnote nonetheless, because the system absorbed her and continued and adjusted its rules in ways designed to prevent repetition. That is what systems do. They absorb anomalies and adjust, but the anomaly happened, and the adjustment required acknowledges, in its own silent way, that the anomaly was real, and that it worked, and that it revealed something about the system that the system would have preferred to keep private. The court that formed around her as empress was not a simple place. Courts are never simple, but the particular complexity of Wu Zetian's court carried the additional dimension of a woman whose authority was both genuine and formally contested, exercised in a space where every transaction of power was also a negotiation about whether a woman exercising power was the right version of the situation or a deviation from it that everyone was choosing not to address directly until the moment arrived when it could be addressed. The people around her were making calculations simultaneously about the practical reality of her authority and about the long-term institutional question of what her authority implied for the framework they all lived inside. These two calculations did not always produce the same recommendations, and the gap between them was one of the spaces she operated in most effectively. She built a network of informants that was specifically her own, separate from the official channels that ran through the normal bureaucratic hierarchy. This was not paranoia exactly, though paranoia and political intelligence are not always clearly distinguished in an environment where the risks are real. It was the practical recognition that the official channels of information were staffed by people whose loyalty was not primarily to her, and that a person in her position who depended entirely on information filtered through loyalties that were not hers was a person who could be managed by what she was and was not told. She wanted to know what was happening in the court, in the provinces, in the conversations that took place outside her direct hearing, and she built mechanisms for knowing it. The use she made of that information varied. Sometimes it was purely defensive, the knowledge of a developing opposition allowing her to preempt it before it became a serious challenge. Sometimes it was more active, the application of the legal apparatus to specific individuals at specific moments, in ways that removed them from the political landscape before they could fully mobilize the threat they represented. The legal system, as we have already seen, was a machine with significant capacity for producing outcomes, and an empress who understood that machine and had the authority to activate it, possessed something that her opponents often did not fully appreciate until the activation had already happened. She was not universally feared. She was also not universally hated, which is an important thing to note about a figure whom later sources tended to present in terms that did not admit much complexity. She had allies, genuine ones, people whose support was not simply coerced or purchased, but reflected actual judgment that her governance was preferable to the alternatives they could imagine. Officials who had risen through the examination system, rather than through aristocratic birth, had reasons, structural ones, to prefer an imperial household that valued examination system talent and promoted it over aristocratic pedigree. Buddhists, including significant clerical figures, had reasons to value a ruler who sponsored Buddhist institutions and drew on Buddhist cosmological frameworks to justify her authority. Provincial interests, who found the old aristocratic families more concerned with the capital's internal politics than with the actual administration of the empire, had reasons to prefer a ruler whose interests ran toward effective administration rather than court intrigue, or at least ran toward a different kind of court intrigue. These were genuine political coalitions, built through genuine attention to interests and genuine delivery of benefits, and they constituted something real about the nature of her rule that the retrospective condemnation of sources shaped by the restored Tang's interest in delegitimizing her tends to obscure. What the sources are more reliable about is the quality of her attention. Multiple accounts, from different periods and different perspectives, converge on the image of someone who was extraordinarily focused on the details of governance, who read the documents and the reports and the petitions with an attention that surprised people who expected a woman in her position to be a figurehead for someone else's governance. She had opinions about military strategy. She had opinions about the examination curriculum. She had opinions about the administration of the granary system. She had opinions about the proper management of border relations with the powers to the north and west that were neither casual nor uninformed. These opinions were expressed and acted on, in the way that the opinions of an emperor were expressed and acted on, because she was the emperor, and her opinions therefore had the particular authority of imperial decision. Her sons were complicated by her, which is perhaps an understatement. The relationship between a mother of extraordinary authority and the sons through whom that authority was theoretically supposed to pass is one of the stranger dynamics in the history of the Tang court. Her eldest son by Gaozong, Li Hong, died in the year 675 while she was still empress, the death coming at a moment when relations between them were reportedly strained, which produced rumours that survived long after any evidence did. Her second son, Li Xian, was made crown prince and then removed by her, demoted and eventually forced into suicide a few years later, an outcome whose causes are entangled with accusations of plotting against her that may or may not have been as substantial as the official record presented them. Her third son, Li Jie, briefly held the throne as Emperor Zhongzong before she had him removed after a few months. Her fourth son, Li Dan, held the position of emperor in a more extended arrangement before she formally declared her own dynasty and made the position of emperor the one she held herself, rather than one she was managing for someone else. What runs through these relationships is something that resists the simple interpretations the sources prefer. She was not simply eliminating sons to clear her path to power, because the timeline and the specific circumstances of each case were more complicated than that narrative requires. She was also not simply a devoted mother who happened to find her sons unsuited to rule and made the necessary adjustments. She was a woman whose relationship with the mechanisms of dynastic succession was genuinely anomalous, who occupied a position that did not have a template, who was making decisions in each specific case within the constraints and opportunities of that case, and whose decisions produced outcomes that the official record presents in ways shaped by what they meant retrospectively, rather than what they were in the moment. The announcement of the Zhou dynasty in 690 was an act of remarkable symbolic audacity. It required Wu Zetian to declare, in formal terms that would be recorded and distributed across the empire, that the mandate of heaven, the cosmic authorization that legitimized imperial rule, had passed from the Li family of the Tang to her own person, in her own name, as the founder of a new dynasty. This was not a modest claim. The mandate of heaven was the most fundamental assertion of political legitimacy in the Chinese imperial tradition, the idea that heaven gave its authorization to rule to persons or families who governed well and withdrew it when they did not. The transfer of the mandate was what transformed a rebellion into a legitimate dynastic change. To claim it required either the confidence that came from genuinely believing it was true, or the political calculation that the mechanisms for contesting it were not strong enough to prevail, or most likely some combination of both. She prepared the ground for the claim over years before making it, in ways that included both genuine policy choices and deliberate symbolic management. The Buddhist establishment that she had cultivated provided theological frameworks that could be used to argue for the compatibility of female rulership with cosmic order. Scholars in her employment produced documents and interpretations that supported her claim to legitimacy. The removal of officials and aristocratic families who formed the natural constituency of Tang Restoration sentiment weakened the institutional basis of opposition, and the simple reality that she had been the effective ruler of the empire for years before the formal declaration meant that the declaration was, in many respects, the acknowledgement of something that the political landscape had already absorbed rather than a disruption of it. She ruled the Zhou dynasty for 15 years. Those years were not peaceful, in the sense that no 15-year period in the governance of a large empire in that era was peaceful. There were military campaigns on the northern borders that went badly and required management. There were internal political conflicts, some of which she navigated with characteristic decisiveness, and some of which she handled less well as she aged. There was the complicated management of an imperial court that contained people who had various reasons to prefer the Tang Restoration, and various calculations about when acting on that preference might be survivable. The restoration came in 705 from within the official apparatus she had built. She was in her early 80s and seriously ill. Senior officials moved when she was too weakened to manage the political situation with her usual clarity, and the speed and the success of their action reflected how completely the official restoration depended on the specific person who had created the system, rather than on the system itself. She abdicated. The Tang was declared restored. She was given the title of Empress Dowager rather than Emperor, which was the restoration's way of managing the historical record, of acknowledging that she had existed while adjusting the terms in which that existence was characterized. She died a few months later. The Zhou dynasty she had declared ended with her. The Tang continued for another century and a half, changed in ways it did not always acknowledge, and carrying the marks of the 15 years it had nominally not existed. The cultural production of her reign was not incidental to its politics. Wu Zetian understood, with the clarity of someone who had spent decades watching how authority was constructed and maintained, that legitimacy was not simply a matter of holding power, but of narrating it, of producing the cultural and intellectual frameworks within which the exercise of power could be understood as correct. She sponsored the compilation of texts. She commissioned scholarship. She patronized artists and poets and thinkers in ways that built a court culture that reflected her authority rather than simply inhabiting the court culture that the Tang had inherited from its predecessors. When a woman who has been told that the cultural tradition does not have a place for her reaches the position where she can shape the cultural tradition, she tends to shape it with a specificity of purpose that people who have always been assumed to belong to the tradition do not require. The literary and intellectual culture of the Tang period is often discussed as a coherent achievement, without always acknowledging how much of what it produced was produced during or immediately following her influence on the court. Poetry flourished. Scholarship flourished. The particular blend of Buddhist, Taoist, and Confucian thought that characterized Tang intellectual life had the room and the patronage to develop in part because the court she presided over had both the resources and the stability that intellectual culture requires. This does not mean the flourishing was simply her personal achievement. Courts of this scale are collective productions. But it means that the account of the Tang as a cultural golden age cannot be fully accurate if it treats the years of her most direct influence as an interruption or an aberration, rather than as part of the period whose achievements are being celebrated. Her relationship with the Buddhist establishment was the most explicitly political of her cultural investments, and also the most philosophically interesting. Buddhism presented for a ruler in her position both challenges and opportunities. The Confucian framework that was the official ideological backbone of the imperial system had no place for female rulership, and said so in terms that were not ambiguous. Buddhism, drawing on a different tradition, with a different cosmology and different precedents, offered more space for the legitimization of unconventional authority, and Zetian engaged with that space actively and deliberately. Buddhist monks and scholars who were willing to argue for the legitimacy of her rule, to find in the canonical literature the precedents and the cosmological frameworks that supported it, found a generous and attentive patron. Texts that served the purpose were commissioned and circulated. The image of Zetian as a kind of incarnate bodhisattva, a being of spiritual authority taking a specific human form to guide the world, was part of the ideological environment her court produced and disseminated. This was political manipulation of religious tradition, and it was also genuine religious engagement, and the distinction between those two things, in a world where religion and politics were not separate categories, requiring separate treatment, is harder to maintain than it might seem from a later vantage point. The people who produced the Buddhist justifications for her authority were not simply being paid to lie. They were working within a genuinely flexible tradition to develop arguments that they may have believed had real merit, because the tradition was flexible enough to support those arguments if you knew how to construct them, and because a court with resources to devote to the question found scholars willing to devote their resources to answering it. The question of what Zetian believed privately and specifically about the religious frameworks she deployed is one that the sources do not resolve, and that the nature of the evidence makes it impossible to resolve with any confidence. What can be said is that her engagement with Buddhism was extensive and sustained across her lifetime, in ways that go beyond what pure political calculation would require, and that the temples and monasteries she sponsored and the texts she commissioned were not simply political gestures, but represented real institutional development of a religious tradition that she found genuinely significant. Whether that significance was spiritual in the sense of involving private conviction, or institutional in the sense of involving strategic investment in a powerful social institution, or both simultaneously in the way that these things are almost always both simultaneously, for rulers who engage with religion at the level she did, is a question that sits in the comfortable ambiguity of historical subjects who did not leave sufficient private documentation to settle it. Her physical health in her later years was a political fact as much as a biological one. An empress who was elderly and unwell was an empress whose ability to manage the court with the directness and speed that she had deployed at her strongest was diminished, and the people around her knew it, and the calculations they made about what was possible shifted accordingly. Courts respond to changes in the physical condition of their central figure in ways that are not always visible in the formal record, but that show up in the pattern of decisions, in the shifting of alliances, in the quiet conversations that begin to happen in corridors rather than in official chambers. The environment that ultimately produced the restoration of the Tang in 705 was not created suddenly in the moments of the coup itself. It had been building across the preceding years, in the gradual recognition that the specific person who had made the system work was becoming less able to make it work, and that the system without her specific management was not the same thing as the system with it. This is the vulnerability that all highly personalized systems face, the dependence on the specific capabilities of the specific individual at their center, which makes succession a perpetual crisis, and which creates the conditions in which determined opponents can always wait for the moment when the individual is weakest. She had managed that vulnerability throughout her reign through the combination of direct control, political intelligence, and the cultivation of enough genuine support that any single opposing group faced the prospect of having to contend not just with her, but with the network she had built. As those personal capabilities diminished, the calculation changed, and the people who had been waiting adjusted their timelines accordingly. She handled the final period with a dignity that her opponents could not entirely deny, according to some accounts, though opponents' accounts of how well or poorly their opponents handled defeat are not always the most reliable sources on the subject. What is clear is that she did not fight the Restoration in a way that extended the political conflict beyond what the specific moment required, which may have reflected pragmatic assessment of what was possible, or may have reflected something else about her relationship to what she had accomplished and what it meant that it was ending. She had been emperor. She was the only person who had ever been emperor in that specific way, and that fact was not going to be erased by the restoration of the Tang, whatever the Tang tried to do with the historical record. It was too large to erase. Too many people had lived inside it. The world that existed in 705 was not the world that would have existed without the 30-odd years between her elevation to empress and her abdication, and the Tang Dynasty that resumed was not the Tang Dynasty that had been. These things were true regardless of what the official record said about them. The night shift in an Imperial Chinese prison is quieter than you expected, but not in the way that quiet is usually a comfort. It is quiet the way a room is quiet when everyone inside it has independently arrived at the conclusion that speaking would be unwise, or perhaps the way that a room is quiet when everyone inside it is too tired or too frightened to fill the silence with noise. The torches on the corridor walls throw orange light that is warm in colour and cold in atmosphere. The shadows they produce are substantial. The smell is something you stopped actively noticing about 6 months into this job, or at least that is what you tell yourself, though there are still moments, usually in the first few minutes after you arrive at the start of a shift, when it reasserts itself clearly enough to remind you that your adaptation is perhaps not as complete as you have been assuming. You have been working in this facility for 2 years. 2 years is long enough to have stopped noticing certain things and not long enough to have stopped noticing others. The smell falls into the first category most of the time. The weight of the accountability falls solidly into the second. Your position in the facility's administrative hierarchy is that of a minor functionary, a title that understates the practical reality of the job in ways that would be funny if the stakes were lower. The magistrates produce decisions, the courts produce sentences, the documentation machinery produces the paper trail that connects decisions to their institutional consequences. But the prison is where all of that arrives in its physical form, as human beings who need to be housed and watched and fed and kept in the specific condition that the law and the documentation require, and you are one of the people responsible for making that happen, every hour of every shift, without error significant enough to appear in the records that move upward through the administrative hierarchy. You come on duty in the early part of the evening when the day shift completes its accounting and hands over responsibility. The accounting is not an abstraction. It is a specific, careful, mandatory process that you conduct with the attention it requires, because the consequences of conducting it carelessly are consequences you would prefer not to experience. Every prisoner present in the facility when your shift begins is a prisoner you are personally accountable for from that moment forward. If they escape, that is your failure and your record. If they die, that requires explanation, and the explanation will be examined, and the examination will determine whether the death fell within the range of outcomes that the system considers acceptable under the circumstances, or whether it represents an error in your management of the population you were responsible for. If they are harmed in ways that the official record of their processing does not account for, that is a problem of a specific kind. If they are not subjected to the processes that their official processing requires, that is a problem of a different specific kind. The accountability runs in multiple directions simultaneously, and you have spent 2 years learning to feel all of them at once, the way a person develops peripheral vision through practice and necessity. The cells are arranged along central corridors in the part of the facility that holds the main population. The construction is stone and heavy timber, because impermanence in a prison creates the kind of problems that solid construction prevents. The doors are reinforced with iron fittings. The observation windows are positioned at a height that allows you to see into the cell without being easily reached through the opening, which is a design feature that reflects the accumulated practical wisdom of people who learned its necessity the unpleasant way. The cells vary in their population depending on the current volume of cases moving through the magistrate's court, and the level of review that the serious cases require before they can be resolved, because until resolution, the people whose cases are pending remain in the facility, and that population fluctuates in ways that create management challenges. the official capacity numbers do not entirely account for. The prisoners represent a genuine variety of situations, and understanding that variety is part of what the job requires. Some are awaiting trial, still formally innocent in the technical sense that the proceeding that will determine their status has not yet reached its conclusion. The law was explicit that people in this category were to be treated differently from those who'd been sentenced, though the practical differences in their daily conditions were not always as distinct as the formal distinction implied. Others have been sentenced and are serving terms that will eventually end. Others are waiting for punishments that have been pronounced but not yet administered, which creates a specific kind of condition in a person that you have learned to recognize and that requires a particular form of attention. You learn to read the population with the same care and specificity that experienced practitioners of any difficult job develop for the specific texture of their work. You know which prisoners are compliant, not out of, if you like the video so far, please leave us a like and a sub. A sub to the channel helps us make more videos for you to watch and keep the channel alive. Not out of contentment, but out of the pragmatic recognition that compliance is the strategy most likely to produce the least bad outcome in their current situation. You know which ones are frightened in a way that makes them careful, and which ones are frightened in a way that makes them unpredictable, and which ones have moved past fear into a kind of settled resignation that is the easiest condition to manage from a practical standpoint. You know which ones have connections outside the facility that make their situation more complicated than a simple reading of their documentation would suggest, and which ones are entirely alone in ways that create their own kind of risk. The feeding is your responsibility on this shift. The official allocation for the prisoner population is specified, not generously, but specifically, with the kind of specificity that reflects the system's interest in maintaining the population in a condition that allows the processing to continue without providing more than that minimum. You distribute what is allocated. Distributing more requires authorization that you do not have for routine meals, and that generating without cause would create exactly the kind of record irregularity that your continued employment depends on avoiding. Distributing less is also documented, because the outcomes of insufficient maintenance of a prisoner population produce the kind of official attention that is more uncomfortable than the attention produced by the irregularity of unauthorized generosity. You work within the allocation with the precision that 2 years of practice has made second nature. The water is managed with the same approach. The temperature of the facility shifts significantly across the seasons, and the seasons in this region have a definite range of opinion about what temperatures are appropriate. Opinion that the stone walls express in their own way. In summer, the heat that accumulates in stone is different from the heat outside, less variable, but no less intense, and it affects the population in ways that require monitoring. In winter, the cold works through the walls with a persistence that stone does not effectively resist, and it affects the population in ways that also require monitoring, though different monitoring. You have developed the specific vocabulary of signs that indicate a prisoner's condition is approaching a threshold that requires action, and you respond to those signs with the efficiency that the job demands, because efficiency is what the job rewards and inefficiency is what it punishes, in the records that move upward from the facility through the administrative hierarchy. The documentation is more central to the work than anyone who has not done it would anticipate. You document intakes, you document conditions, you document incidents both minor and significant, you document the daily status of the population you are responsible for, you document anything that deviates from the expected in ways that are large enough to require recording. All of this documentation exists within a system of oversight that is not theoretical. The magistrate's office receives regular reports. The reviewing bodies that have authority over serious cases have access to facility records that bear on those cases. The accountability that flows from the documentation is real, which means the documentation is real, and the care with which you produce it reflects your understanding of what an inconsistent or incomplete record means for the person who produced it. The facility is also the location where certain formal processes of the legal proceeding take place. Interrogation of prisoners in the examination of serious cases happens here, in rooms that are equipped for the purpose. You are adjacent to these processes in ways that require you to understand them clearly, even when you are not directly conducting them. The formal rules governing the application of coercive questioning were explicit and specific in the Tang Code and its successors. Authorization was required for each application. The forms of permitted application were defined. The number of applications that could be made in the course of a single investigation was limited. The condition of the prisoner before and after was supposed to be assessed. These were real rules, not merely theoretical ones, and they reflected genuine understanding within the official system that the outcomes of unlimited coercive questioning were not reliable. Because pain produces agreement regardless of the underlying truth, an agreement produced by pain does not constitute the accurate information that the system needed to function correctly. Whether those rules were followed consistently in every proceeding that took place in every facility across the Empire is a different question, and the answer to that question is no, they were not, because rules in large systems are never followed with perfect consistency, and the oversight mechanisms that were supposed to catch inconsistencies operated with the same imperfections that oversight mechanisms in large systems always have. You know what you know about the practices in this specific facility, in the rooms where these processes take place, and what you know has required you to make a certain kind of peace with your proximity to certain kinds of sounds and outcomes. That peace is not the same as approval. It is the accommodation that a person who understands their position in a large system makes with the aspects of that system that are not within their individual authority to change. Prisoners occasionally die. This is a reality of a facility that houses people in conditions that are not designed for health and comfort, across periods of time that can extend through seasons, in an era before the medical understanding that might have prevented some of the causes of death was available. When a prisoner dies, the documentation requirements expand significantly. An account of the circumstances must be produced. The account must be consistent with the other records in ways that examination would confirm. The category of the death, whether natural, whether due to the conditions of confinement, whether the result of an official process, whether something that falls outside those categories, determines what happens next in the official record, and what happens next in the official record determines what happens next to you. You have handled 2 deaths during your 2 years in this position. Both were documented with care, both were reviewed, both were found to be consistent with the records. This is a thing you are quietly aware of as a measure of your competence, in the way that people who work in systems where the measures of competence are specific and consequential become quietly aware of their specific record of those measures. There are nights when the facility is more active than others, when cases of particular complexity or sensitivity are in process, and the level of official attention focused on the place is higher than its ordinary background level. You manage those nights differently, with an additional layer of attention in every direction, an additional carefulness in the documentation, an additional awareness of the things that need to be visible and the things that need to be not visible in ways that the records you produce make possible. This is not corruption exactly, or not always. It is the management of information by someone who understands what information, presented in which ways, produces which outcomes, and who makes the choices available to them with the goals of doing the job correctly and remaining in a position to continue doing the job correctly. There are also quieter nights, when the current population is stable and the documentation is current, and the rounds can be made with a thoroughness that is almost restful, if restful is a word that applies to anything about this job. On those nights you walk the corridors and check the cells and make the mental notes that will become written notes later, and you feel the particular satisfaction that comes from being good at something difficult. Not happy exactly, not comfortable, but competent, which is the thing the system values most and the thing you have managed to become. The torches burn down toward the end of the shift and are replaced by the next shift's personnel before they go entirely out. The accounting transfers. The population is handed over with its full documentation current. You leave the facility and walk out into air that is different from the air inside, cooler and less contained, and for a few steps you notice it clearly before it becomes just air again. Another shift done. Another night that proceeded the way nights in this facility are supposed to proceed. The records will confirm it, and tomorrow, or the next night, or whenever your rotation brings you back, the machine will be running exactly as it was, waiting for you to take up your place in it again. The hierarchy within the facility itself is something you learned over the first months, in ways that the formal job description did not cover. The formal description described duties, schedules, and reporting lines. The actual hierarchy added texture to those things, layers of informal authority that sat alongside the formal structure and sometimes complicated it in ways that required careful navigation. The senior jailer, who had been in the facility for considerably longer than you, possessed a kind of practical authority over daily operations that exceeded what his formal title strictly conferred, and the relationship between what he directed and what the official records of the facility said was directed was something you had learned to understand as a distinction rather than a contradiction. Both were real. They occupied different registers of the institution's operation, and managing both registers simultaneously, without creating friction between them, was part of the actual work. The clerks who maintained the official documentation were another layer entirely. They were not security personnel. They were not responsible for the physical management of the population. But they held a specific kind of power that was not adequately described as administrative, because the records they produced and maintained were the institutional reality of the facility, the version of events that existed for the purposes of the review processes that extended upward from the facility into the broader judicial apparatus. A conflict between what the records said and what had actually happened was a problem that could have consequences for everyone in the facility, up to and including the senior jailer and the magistrate whose authority the facility operated under. The clerks understood this. You understood it. The relationship between your work and their records was therefore a relationship you managed with the same attention you gave the prisoner population, because the documentation was, in a functional sense, a parallel population with its own requirements and its own risks. There was a prisoner in your first year who presented a specific kind of problem, not because of his behaviour within the facility, which was entirely compliant, but because of who he was outside it. He was a minor official, a low-ranking functionary from a department whose work touched the taxation of certain categories of agricultural production, and he had been accused of an irregularity in the collection records that may or may not have been deliberate. His case was straightforward enough in its formal category, a potential offence against official duty of modest severity, the kind of case that moved through the system at a predictable pace. But he had a brother who was a more senior official in a different department, and that brother had connections that extended into corners of the administrative landscape that the facility's official chain of command did not directly reach. You noticed the attention the senior jailer gave to this prisoner's documentation, the particular care with which records of his condition and treatment were maintained, the additional attention paid to ensuring that his official treatment was at every measurable point consistent with the formal requirements of his category. Not better than required, which would be its own kind of irregularity, exactly as required, with the consistency that left no gap for criticism. You understood what you were seeing. It was the facility managing its relationship with a social reality that existed outside its walls, through the mechanism of documentation that could be produced if the outside reality ever inquired. The brother did not inquire directly. The case resolved in the ordinary way, the confession was obtained through the examination process, the category was confirmed, the penalty was administered, the documentation was complete and consistent. But the attention the facility paid to that specific case was different from the attention it paid to cases where the social networks outside the walls ran less far and less high, and that difference was itself a piece of practical knowledge about how the system actually worked, the kind of knowledge that does not appear in the formal description of the job, but that shapes the actual practice of it in ways you carry with you every night when you make your rounds. The sounds of the facility at its various hours have become familiar in ways that you no longer entirely notice, but that have become a kind of background sense, a continuous read of the population's state that updates in your awareness without requiring your active attention. You know the difference between the sounds of a night that is ordinary and the sounds of a night that has something developing in it, not because you can always specify exactly what you're hearing, but because 2 years of listening to the same space produce an understanding of its normal register that makes deviations audible as deviations rather than as noise. When something is off, you know it before you have consciously analysed why. You act on that knowledge. It has been useful. The space between what the prisoners know about their situations and what the official record says about their situations is another thing you have become attentive to. Prisoners are not uninformed about their cases. They receive formal communications at specified stages of the proceeding. They have access, in theory if not always in practice, to people who can advise them. They have their own understandings of the system they are inside, derived from experience or from the accounts of people who have been through it before them, and those understandings are sometimes accurate and sometimes not, and the gap between their understanding and the official reality is often visible in their behaviour in ways that tell you something about where their case is and what they expect to happen. You're not supposed to inform them. Your role in the proceeding is defined, and the informational relationship between the facility and the prisoners it houses is governed by formal rules about what communications are permitted at which stages and through which channels. But there is also the human reality of people who are frightened and confused, and who sometimes ask you things, not with the expectation that you will answer, but with the desperate hope that someone in the vicinity will say something that is not the system saying something through you. You have developed the practice of silence in those moments, which is not unkind in the way that a refusal is unkind, but is also not neutral, because silence in response to fear is its own form of communication, and you know it. The exit from the facility at the end of a shift involves a physical transition that you have come to pay attention to in a way you did not initially. You pass through the gate and into the street, and the air is different, and the sounds are different, and the quality of your accountability is different in a way that is immediately legible to your body, even when your mind is still processing the shift's events. You're outside the machine. The machine continues without you. This is, in its way, a form of relief, and you allow yourself to feel it without attaching anything more complicated to it than the simple fact of a shift completed and the ordinary freedom of the street resuming around you. You eat something. You sleep. The body's requirements reassert themselves with the insistence that bodies always deploy against the competing requirements of institutional life, and you comply with them because non-compliance produces deficits that eventually affect the quality of the work, and the quality of the work is the thing that matters, the thing that the records reflect, the thing that your tenure in this position depends on. You rest because rest is maintenance, the same as the water and the food that the facility provides to the population in its care, the minimum necessary to keep the system functioning at the level the system requires. And then the rotation brings you back, and the gate opens, and the accounting begins again, and you are inside the machine, and the machine needs its people to keep it running, and you are one of those people, and that is the shape of the work, and the shape of the work is what you have made your life inside of, and you make your rounds. To look at the Chinese imperial legal system from the outside through the lens of its official documentation and its formal theoretical framework is to encounter something genuinely impressive. The Tang Code's 500 articles, refined across decades of scholarly and official work, represented one of the most comprehensive attempts in pre-modern history to create a consistent, reviewable, documented legal framework applicable across an enormous and diverse territory. The principle of review, the process by which serious cases moved upward through multiple levels of official examination before final disposition, was a genuine structural protection against the worst failures of purely local arbitrary judgment. The accountability of officials who faced penalties for incorrect application of the code was documented and enforced in ways that were not purely symbolic. The examination system that staffed the bureaucracy, while not perfectly meritocratic, was more open to talent across social lines than most comparable systems of its era. The official image of this legal apparatus was one of rationality, consistency, and institutional integrity, and that image was not entirely false. But the gap between the official image and the lived reality was wide enough and consistent enough across time and place to constitute something worth examining carefully, not because the system was simply corrupt, because it was not, but because the gap reveals something true about the relationship between formal systems and human behaviour that has not become obsolete. The most structurally significant gap was built directly into the system's own logic, and it was the requirement of confession. Chinese imperial law, across the Tang, Song, Ming and Qing periods, and into the legal thinking that connected them, required an admission of guilt as the highest and most reliable form of proof. The reasoning was not simply authoritarian, though it had authoritarian implications. It reflected a genuine philosophical position that a person's own acknowledgement of what they had done was the clearest possible form of establishing that it had happened, more reliable in some ways than witness testimony, which could be mistaken or corrupted, or circumstantial evidence, which could be interpreted in multiple directions. A confession was direct. It was the accused person's own voice stating the truth of the matter. The mechanism this created was as predictable as the reasoning was coherent. If a confession was the highest form of proof, and if the system had formal tools for obtaining confessions from defendants who were reluctant to provide them, then the pressure on officials to use those tools was structural. An official who closed cases with confessions was an official whose record reflected successful operation of the system. An official whose cases remained open, whose defendants maintained their innocence through extended proceedings, was an official whose performance looked different. The incentive was not to torture exactly, but it was to produce the confession, and the tools available for producing confessions that defendants did not spontaneously provide were tools that involved pain. The Tang Code's regulations on those tools were real. The categories of offence that required authorization before coercive questioning could be applied were specified. The number of applications permitted in a single investigation was limited to a total, across all episodes, that was designed to prevent the most extreme abuses. The requirement that the physical condition of the prisoner be assessed before each application was an acknowledgement that there was a threshold beyond which the process became something the system officially rejected, and the accountability of officials who obtained confessions through excessive coercion was genuine, in the sense that if it came to light, it was punished. But several factors prevented these formal protections from functioning as fully as their formal existence implied. The oversight mechanism depended on the problem coming to light, which required the defendant or someone acting on their behalf to formally allege that the coercion had exceeded permitted levels and to pursue that allegation through formal channels. Formal channels were operated by officials who were peers of the official being accused. Defendants making these allegations were doing so from inside the system, while themselves being processed by it, from a position of considerable structural disadvantage. The formal right to allege improper coercion existed and was occasionally exercised with success, but the conditions required for that success were conditions that not every defendant possessed. False confessions entered the record and proceeded through it as if they were true. The review mechanisms that were supposed to catch incorrect outcomes at the lower levels could catch errors of incorrect legal categorization or incorrect application of prescribed penalties more reliably than they could catch errors whose source was a confession that was factually wrong, because the review process took the documentary record as its primary material and the confession was in the documentary record. The second major structural gap was social, and unlike the gap around confessions, which at least created some tension between the formal rules and the formal outcomes they were supposed to produce, this gap was openly stated in the formal rules themselves. The Tang Code was explicit about the fact that not everyone was subject to it in the same way. The principle of the 8 considerations identified categories of people whose cases required special procedures before serious punishments could be applied, including relatives of the emperor, persons of great virtue, persons of extraordinary ability or talent, those who had performed great services to the state, and the families of officials above a certain rank. The formal privilege of noble rank reduced the penalties applicable to certain offences for those who held such rank. The 10 ranks of officials carried with them specific legal protections in the event of accusation. This was not hypocrisy in the ordinary sense, a gap between stated principle and unstated practice. The stated principle was differential treatment based on social hierarchy. The Confucian framework that undergirded the entire legal system held that social hierarchy was morally meaningful, that the same act committed by a person of high status and a person of low status did not occupy the same moral position in the cosmic order, because the relationships that each person embodied were different, and those relationships carried different weights and therefore different consequences. An official who violated his duty was violating not just a rule, but a relationship of trust with the emperor and with the cosmic order that the emperor represented. A common person who violated the same law was violating a different set of relationships with different weights. The law reflected this philosophical position openly, and the philosophical position was genuinely held, not merely used as cover. The practical consequence was that wealth and status provided insulation from the full force of the legal machinery in ways that were both formally sanctioned and informally amplified. The formally sanctioned protections were in the code. The informally amplified ones operated through the same social networks that structured every other aspect of life in Imperial China. An accused official with extensive family connections, social alliances built over years of service, and the ability to engage the best legal advisors and petition writers had a relationship to the proceeding against them that differed substantially from the relationship of an accused person with none of these resources. The formal review processes were the same for both. The informal resources available to navigate those processes were not. The third gap was geographic, and it widened as you moved farther from the centres of imperial authority. The Tang Dynasty administered an empire that stretched across distances that, in an era before rapid communication, meant real differences in the quality and consistency of oversight. The mechanisms designed to keep local magistrates accountable, the review processes, the reporting requirements, the regular reassignment of officials so that they did not become too embedded in local networks, were real mechanisms that functioned with real effect. They were not nothing, but they functioned better in the capital and in major administrative centres than in remote postings where the infrastructure of oversight was thinner, where the volume of official travel and inspection was lower, and where the practical ability of people at the receiving end of a local official's decisions to reach the channels of formal appeal was more constrained. The rotation system that regularly moved officials from posting to posting was designed to prevent exactly the kind of entrenched local interest that made independent oversight difficult. If you like the video so far, please leave us a like and a sub. A sub to the channel helps us make more videos for you to watch and keep the channel alive. A magistrate who had spent 20 years in a single community had 20 years of social connections, obligations, debts and relationships that compromised the impartiality the system formally required. Moving officials prevented this, and the principle was sound. But it also meant that magistrates arrived in their postings as outsiders, unfamiliar with the local language in many cases, dependent on local staff and informants for the practical knowledge that doing the job required, and those local staff and informants were people with their own local interests that the rotation system had not rotated away. The confession requirement, the social hierarchy protections, and the geographic inconsistency of oversight combined with a fourth factor that operated more subtly and more pervasively than any of them: the general human tendency of institutions to protect themselves. When cases arose that reflected poorly on the system, the response was rarely public examination and transparent correction. It was internal management, the quiet transfer, the carefully worded report, the gentle discouragements applied to those who might raise their voices about what they had experienced. This was not unique to ancient China. It is the way that institutions behave when they understand, correctly or not, that their own credibility is a social good worth protecting, and that the costs of transparency in a specific case exceed the benefits that transparency might provide. The system did have genuine self-correction mechanisms, and they were not merely theoretical. Officials were punished for errors in application. Cases were overturned on appeal. Formal complaints did reach higher levels of the bureaucracy and were sometimes acted on with real effect. The drum that any person could theoretically strike outside the magistrate's yamen to bring a grievance directly to official attention was sometimes struck, and sometimes the striking produced results. These were not performances, they were real. But they were also embedded in the same social and hierarchical conditions that shaped everything else, and their operation reflected those conditions. The person most likely to successfully navigate the formal appeal and correction mechanisms was not the person most likely to have been incorrectly processed by the system in the first place. The distribution of who could successfully use the formal protections and who could not was not random. It tracked, with depressing consistency, the same social and economic distributions that structured the rest of life. What the ordinary person encountered when they encountered this system was therefore something genuinely complex and genuinely difficult to characterize simply. The Tang Code was real. The formal protections it contained were real. The review processes that were supposed to catch errors were real. The accountability of officials was real, and the gap between these formal realities and the experience of people who went through the system without social resources or connections was also real, consistently real, documented in ways that the formal record preserves precisely because the formal record was designed to capture everything, and therefore captured its own limitations along with its successes. That gap has not been unique to ancient China, and it has not disappeared from human experience in the centuries since. Every formal legal system that has ever been built by human beings has encountered some version of this problem. The problem of creating a machinery of justice that is abstract enough to be consistent and concrete, enough to be fair, that can hold both the principle of equal treatment and the reality of an unequal world, that can protect the rights it formally acknowledges while operating in the social conditions that make those rights more accessible to some people than to others. Ancient China's legal thinkers thought hard about this problem. They produced solutions that were genuinely creative in some cases and genuinely inadequate in others. They produced a system that lasted, in its successive revised forms, for over 1,000 years, which is itself a kind of evidence that it was providing something real to the society it served, not justice perfectly distributed, but enough order and enough predictability and enough genuine protection to function as the framework within which ordinary life could proceed. The clerks who ground the ink and wrote the records, the magistrates who asked the careful questions, the jailers who made their rounds and kept their documentation current, the defendants who sat in waiting rooms watching the light move across the floor, the officials who reviewed cases in the capital, the people who struck the drum outside the yamen and waited to see whether anyone answered. They were all inside the same machine, doing different things, experiencing it from different positions, understanding different things about it based on where in the system they stood. What they all shared was the experience of being inside something larger than any of them, something that had been thinking about them longer than they had been thinking about it, something that processed what it received with impersonal efficiency and produced outcomes that were sometimes what the formal rules said they should be, and sometimes different from that in ways that the formal rules did not account for. That experience is recognizable. It has not aged. The specific robes and the specific bamboo rods and the specific vocabulary of the Tang Code have receded into history. The experience of being inside a large formal system that believes in its own justice while being imperfectly just has not receded at all. The relationship between the formal machinery of the law and the informal customs that governed daily life was never as cleanly separable as the official image of the legal system implied. People who lived under Imperial Chinese law did not experience it as a discrete system operating in a separate domain from everything else in their lives. They experienced it as one layer of a larger social reality, interpenetrating with everything else, sometimes reinforcing informal customs and sometimes in tension with them, sometimes applying to situations that informal resolution would otherwise have handled, and sometimes irrelevant to situations that the official framework might technically claim jurisdiction over. The texture of this interpenetration was something that people in specific communities with specific social histories understood from the inside, in ways that the formal texts of the code could not capture. Village life in the Tang and subsequent dynasties organized much of its social and economic activity through structures that the official system acknowledged, supported, and sometimes co-opted without fully controlling. The clan structure, the extended family networks that shared surnames and in many cases shared descent from common ancestors, maintained their own mechanisms for internal dispute resolution, their own welfare systems for members in difficulty, their own moral authority over the behaviour of the people within them. When a dispute arose between members of the same clan, the first recourse was typically internal to the clan, handled by elders whose authority came from the combination of age, social position, and the accumulated weight of the community's recognised wisdom, rather than from official appointment. Only when internal resolution failed, or when the seriousness of the situation exceeded what the clan could handle, or when one party had reasons to prefer the official system over the informal one, did the proceeding move toward the magistrate's yamen. The guild structures that organised commercial life in cities and market towns operated similarly. A dispute between merchants who were both members of the same guild was a guild matter, before it was a legal matter, and the guild had both the interest and the mechanisms to resolve it internally if at all possible, because official legal proceedings were expensive and disruptive, and produced records that could affect a merchant's standing in ways that the guild's internal resolution would not. The official system was aware of these parallel structures and in many cases formally acknowledged their authority over internal disputes, while also maintaining the formal capacity to override that authority when circumstances warranted. This created an environment in which the ordinary person's encounter with the official legal system was more episodic and more situational than a simple account of imperial rule would suggest. Most people, in most of their dealings, most of the time, operated within the informal structures of clan and community and guild without direct engagement with the official apparatus. The official apparatus was present as a background reality, a guaranteed option, a source of both protection and threat, but not a constant presence in daily life. It was the exceptional cases, the disputes too serious or too intractable for informal resolution, the offences against the state's own interests or the interests of powerful parties who had access to official channels, the situations where the informal structures had broken down or been insufficient, that brought ordinary people into direct contact with the machinery we have been examining. This meant that for many people, the experience of encountering the official legal system was, by definition, already an experience of exceptional circumstances, of situations that had moved beyond the ordinary management capacity of the social structures they normally relied on. The quality of fear and disorientation that the examining room produced was not simply a response to the authority of the magistrate. It was a response to the experience of being outside the normal structures of social management, in a space where the usual sources of guidance and support and collective understanding were not available in their usual forms, where the familiar vocabulary of community expectation and mutual obligation had given way to a different vocabulary that belonged to a different system and required different knowledge to navigate. The people who navigated it most successfully were the people who had learned that different vocabulary, either through direct experience, which was generally an education with high costs, or through the knowledge accumulated by communities that had sufficient history with the official system to have developed practical guides to its operation. Legal advisors, people whose knowledge of the code and the official processes allowed them to assist others in managing their encounters with the system, existed in various forms across the Imperial period, not always as formally recognized practitioners, but as people whose expertise was available to those who could access it. Their existence was itself a response to the gap between the official system's pretension to clarity and accessibility and the actual complexity of navigating it without specialized knowledge. The physical spaces of punishment beyond the examination and the imprisonment were also spaces of public meaning. Corporal punishment under the code was in some cases public, and its publicity was not incidental. The sight of official punishment being applied in a public space communicated the reality of the legal system's authority to observers who might not have direct involvement with any proceeding. It was the system making itself visible, demonstrating its capacity, performing the function of deterrence in the most concrete possible way. The shame component of public punishment was inseparable from the physical component, because shame in a Confucian social framework was not simply personal humiliation but a social fact, a shift in one's standing in the relational networks that structured life, with implications that extended beyond the moment of punishment itself. Exile, the removal of a person from their community, and from the social networks that sustained them, to a distant location chosen specifically for its distance from everything familiar, operated through a similar logic, using the disruption of social belonging as the mechanism of punishment. The person exiled to the southern frontier in an era when the frontier was genuinely remote, and the journey there was itself an ordeal, was not simply being inconvenienced by relocation. They were being cut off from the clan, the community, the familiar social world that was the actual substance of daily life, and placed in an environment where they were strangers without the accumulated relationships and standing that gave them a position in the world they knew. The punishment was the disconnection, as much as the hardship, and the hardship was significant. Death penalties in serious cases, which required the elaborate review processes and ultimately imperial authorization, were occasions of significant ritual gravity. The legal system's most extreme expression of its own authority was surrounded by formal requirements that acknowledged in their own way the weight of what was being done. The imperial review of capital cases was not simply bureaucratic procedure. It was the emperor personally assuming the cosmological responsibility for the exercise of the state's ultimate power over life, in the tradition that held him accountable to heaven for the justice of that exercise. This is why amnesties at imperial celebrations had the particular form they did, why the emperor's mercy in reducing capital sentences to lesser punishments was understood as an expression of imperial virtue rather than simply as administrative discretion. The cosmological framework was not decoration. It was the conceptual architecture within which the entire system understood itself and its own legitimacy. And it is that understanding that the system existed within a framework of meaning that was larger than the individual case, and larger than the individual magistrate, and larger than the specific emperor who happened to be on the throne, that may be the most important thing to take away from a careful look at how it actually operated. The gap between the official image and the lived reality was real. The formal rules were imperfectly followed. The review processes were imperfectly accessible. The social hierarchies the system claimed to transcend it perpetuated through other means. All of this is true, and the people inside the system making their rounds or answering questions or reviewing documents in the capital or writing the interpretive commentaries that shaped how the code was applied, understood themselves to be participating in something that mattered, that was trying, however imperfectly, to maintain the order that made human life possible. That was part of a tradition of thought and practice that took justice seriously as a concept even when it fell short of it as an outcome. That combination, the genuine aspiration and the genuine falling short, the careful framework and the imperfect practice, the formal idealism and the informal reality, is not unique to ancient China. It is perhaps the permanent condition of human institutions when they are being honest about themselves. The systems we build to organize collective life are built by people who believe they are doing something important and who are, in the doing of it, imperfect. The gap is the evidence of both things simultaneously, the importance and the imperfection, and it is a gap that tells us something true about what it means to try to be just in a world that is not naturally inclined toward it. The fifth dimension of the gap, and perhaps the most philosophically interesting one, was the relationship between the letter of the law and the spirit of social relationships, which in the Confucian framework were not supposed to be in tension, but which in practice were frequently exactly that. The code tried to encode the social relationships it considered foundational, the hierarchy of ruler and minister, parent and child, husband and wife, older sibling and younger sibling, friend and friend, and to make the legal consequences of violations of those relationships correspond to the moral weight the framework assigned them. An offence against a parent was more serious than the same act committed against a stranger. An offence against a ruler was more serious than an offence against a private citizen. These were not arbitrary distinctions. They reflected the genuine Confucian conviction that the proper ordering of primary relationships was the foundation of social peace, and that the law's role was to reinforce those relationships rather than to operate independently of them. The problem was that real relationships in real societies are complicated in ways that formal hierarchies do not account for. Parents who had behaved badly toward their children created situations where the legal framework's emphasis on filial piety, on the absolute duty of the child to the parent regardless of the parent's conduct, pressed against the intuitive sense that the framework's protections should not extend to cases where the relationship itself had been violated at its source. Rulers whose behaviour was unjust by the framework's own standards created situations where the absolute duty of the minister to the ruler pressed against the framework's simultaneous insistence on virtue as the foundation of legitimate authority. These were real tensions that real people in real situations had to navigate, and the formal resolution the code offered was not always satisfying. Legal scholars and official commentators grappled with these tensions in their interpretive work. They developed qualifications and exceptions and categories of circumstances that allowed the formal logic to accommodate some of the complexity that the world kept producing. But the gap between the framework's idealized version of social relationships and the actual texture of human life in a society of many millions of people was never closed, because it could not be. The law was trying to produce a version of social life that the Confucian framework considered correct. An actual social life was produced by actual people, which meant it kept generating complications that the framework had not anticipated and that the law's mechanisms were not perfectly suited to resolve. The sixth dimension was temporal in a different sense from the one we have already noted, not just the change of law over time, but the relationship between the legal system and the seasons of human life. Ancient Chinese law did not treat the timing of offences and punishments as irrelevant. There were formal provisions about the timing of executions, for instance, reflecting the cosmological understanding that certain times of year were appropriate for death and others were not, that imposing capital punishment during the growing season violated a natural order that the law was supposed to reinforce rather than disrupt. Amnesties were issued at significant imperial moments, celebrations of victories or accessions or other occasions of state significance, which released some categories of prisoners and commuted some categories of sentences. These seasonal and ceremonial rhythms of the legal system reflected its embeddedness in a larger cosmological framework that treated human governance as part of a natural order that included heaven and earth and the forces that connected them. The emperor's role as mediator between heaven and human society was not metaphorical, or not only metaphorical. It was a political and religious reality that shaped how the legal system understood itself and how it justified the authority of the people who operated it. A magistrate asking questions in a proceeding was participating in an activity that had cosmic significance, not just institutional significance, because the proper administration of justice was understood to be one of the things that maintained the proper relationship between heaven and the human world, and improper administration of justice was one of the things that disrupted it. This gave the legal practitioners of ancient China a sense of the stakes of their work that was different from, and in some ways higher than, what a purely secular account of institutional function would produce. They were not just processing cases, they were participating in the maintenance of cosmic order. This conviction could produce genuine seriousness and care. It could also produce the particular kind of arrogance that accompanies the belief that one's institutional role has cosmological sanction, and that arrogance was one of the things that made the accountability mechanisms necessary, because a system that understood itself as cosmically sanctioned had built-in resistance to the ordinary forms of external correction. The ordinary people who encountered this system, the farmers and merchants and artisans and servants, who made up the overwhelming majority of the population, and whose encounters with the legal apparatus were typically the most consequential and the least resourced, understood the system in a different register from the one in which legal scholars and officials discussed it. They understood it primarily through the experience of encountering it, through the stories of others who had encountered it, through the practical knowledge of a community that had accumulated understanding of how the local magistrate tended to handle various kinds of cases, and what kinds of situations were worth escalating, and what kinds were worth resolving through other channels. The other channels were real and important. Most disputes that could theoretically have become legal cases did not become legal cases, because the system itself, and the communities around it, had multiple mechanisms for resolution that operated below the threshold of official proceeding. Community mediation by respected elders, private settlement between the parties with witnesses, the involvement of clan or guild structures that had their own internal mechanisms for managing disputes among their members, all of these served to resolve the bulk of interpersonal conflict without it reaching the magistrate's formal apparatus. The formal apparatus was the last resort, or the resource for situations where other channels had failed or were not available, or where one party had the resources and the will to pursue the formal path and the other party did not. This meant that the formal system's reach into daily life was both wide and selective. Wide, because its authority was in principle universal, applicable to everyone in the territory under its jurisdiction. Selective, because in practice the cases it actively processed were a subset of the situations that technically fell within its authority, filtered through the mechanisms of informal resolution, community management, and the practical calculations of parties who understood that formal proceedings had costs that might exceed the benefits of whatever outcome they hoped to achieve. The costs were real. A legal proceeding required time, required resources, required engagement with a bureaucratic process that was not easy to navigate without knowledge and assistance. Waiting for the proceeding to run its course while imprisoned awaiting trial was itself a cost that fell on defendants in ways that had nothing to do with the eventual outcome of their case. Even defendants who were ultimately found to have done nothing wrong, or whose cases were resolved in the most favourable way available to them, had paid the cost of the time inside the system, the disruption of their lives and work and family relationships, the social marking that came from having been involved in an official proceeding regardless of how it resolved. The system did not refund those costs. The system did not acknowledge them as costs. The system only acknowledged the formal record, which began at intake and ended at resolution, and what happened to a person's life in the interval was not the system's concern. That gap between what the formal record captured and what the experience actually cost is perhaps the most human of all the gaps we have been examining. It is the one that is most recognizable across the centuries and across the specific contexts that separate ancient China from anywhere else. Every formal system that processes human beings creates this gap between its official account of what is happening and the lived experience of the people it is processing, and every formal system, to greater or lesser degrees, handles that gap by treating its own account as the relevant one, and the lived experience as something that happens alongside the proceeding, but does not alter it. This is not cynicism exactly. It is the condition of formal systems, which cannot operate if they must account for every dimension of every experience every person inside them is having simultaneously. They are selective by necessity, capturing what they are designed to capture and treating everything else as context that may be acknowledged informally but does not change the record. The The question is always whether what they capture is the right subset of what matters, whether the selection serves the purposes the system exists to serve, whether the gap between the record and the experience is the necessary and manageable gap of any functioning institution, or the significant and corrosive gap of a system that has drifted from the purposes it claimed. Ancient China's legal system, across its long history, sat at different points on that spectrum at different times and in different places. At its best, it provided genuine protection for ordinary people against the worst forms of arbitrary power, genuine accountability for officials who abused their positions, genuine rationality in the application of penalties that made the consequences of actions predictable in ways that supported stable social life. At its worst, it provided the formal vocabulary of justice while producing outcomes that the vocabulary could not fully describe and would not fully acknowledge. In most places and most times, it sat somewhere in the middle, doing some of both, as human institutions tend to do, as imperfect instruments of legitimate purposes, doing real work in the world and doing that work imperfectly, and leaving behind a record that is worth reading carefully, because the imperfections in it are also part of the truth. There is something quiet that connects all the rooms we visited tonight. The examining room where questions were asked and answers became documents, and documents became decisions. The long corridors where Zetian watched and learned and waited and moved, patient across decades, until the moment arrived when patience could become something else. The prison. If you like the video so far, please leave us a like and a sub. A sub to the channel helps us make more videos for you to watch and keep the channel alive. The prison corridor where the torch burned down toward the end of the shift, and the documentation sat in order, and the rounds had been made and the population was accounted for. The official reading of a code that had been worked out with great care by people who believed that precision in the law was a form of moral seriousness. In each of those rooms, there were people doing what people have always done when the systems they live inside are larger than they can hold in their hands, and do not always work the way the official version says they should. They paid attention. They learned the specific vocabulary of the specific system they were inside. They understood which parts of the official image were solid and which parts were thinner than they appeared. They made accommodations that were sometimes small and sometimes significant. They kept going. The person sitting in the magistrate's waiting room watching the light move across the floor was not passive, even in their stillness. They were thinking. They were paying attention to every signal the proceeding sent about what mattered and what did not, about where the formal logic was genuinely firm and where it had softened into something more negotiable. They were doing the hard interior work of understanding their situation clearly, because understanding your situation clearly is not the same as being resigned to it. It is the precondition for whatever comes next. Zetian, in the years when the story most people know had not yet begun, when she was still in the convent with the shaved head and the religious schedule and the official conclusion of her relevance, was also paying attention. She was thinking about the system she'd been inside and would be inside again. She was not waiting passively. She was accumulating the understanding that a particular kind of intelligence, applied over a particular kind of time to a particular kind of system, eventually produces. The system thought the story was over. It was not. The jailer making the night rounds understood something that people who have never managed a system from the inside tend to underestimate, which is that keeping a complicated thing functioning correctly is real work, unglamorous and unceasing and essential, and that the people who do it are participating in something larger than themselves in ways that the formal record both captures and reduces simultaneously. The record captures that the rounds were made and the counts were correct and the documentation was in order. It cannot capture what it cost to make them, night after night, in that particular air, with that particular quality of accountability pressing in from every direction at once. Nor does the record require that cost to be legible. The system is not concerned with what it costs to keep the system running. It is concerned with whether the system is running, and it was running. That, in the end, is what the record says. And that, in the end, is what it was always going to say. The record captures that the rounds were made and the documentation was current. It reduces the texture of what it actually cost to be the person making those rounds, night after night, in that particular air, with that particular accountability pressing in from every direction. These things connect, across centuries, across the specific context of their original moments, because the underlying situation is the same. People inside large systems, learning those systems from the inside, making what accommodations they can, maintaining what integrity they can, paying the prices the system extracts and finding, when they can, what the system does not see how to take. It is late now. The quality of the hour has changed. The world you're in is settling into its nighttime version, quieter and less pressured, and the specific rooms we visited tonight are receding back into the distance of history where they came from. The examining room and its documents, the court where the questions were asked and the answers became records, the long life of the woman who refused to be finished when the system declared her finished, the corridor and the torches and the rounds, the careful gap between the official image and the lived reality, tended by generations of people on both sides of it. Let all of that rest. History is patient. It will be exactly where you left it when you come back to it. Tonight it has done its work, offered what it has to offer, which is the recognition that the things people have always struggled with are the same things, in the same texture, across enormously different surfaces, and that knowing this is a comfort of a specific kind, quiet and durable, the kind that settles rather than excites. Your job right now is simpler than any of theirs. You're not inside any machine that requires your attention tonight. The documentation is someone else's concern. The rounds are complete. The weight of what the day required can be set down. Let your breathing slow. Let the particular silence of where you are become the only thing that matters, not the silence of a waiting room, not the silence of a corridor with torches burning down, but the silence of a night that belongs to you entirely, without accountability, without proceedings, without the weight of a record that will be examined in the morning. Sleep now. It has all been accounted for. The clerks have gone home. The torches are going out. The light has reached the end of the floor and stopped where floors stop, and that is exactly where it is supposed to be. Where in the world are you watching from? Let me know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe if you want to see more videos like this. See you on the next one.